I'm gonna get this technology stuff going on my end. Clarkston, hello. I drove through Clarkston on my way to Rochester.
What is it? Is that all right?
All right.
It's somebody else's screen.
Someone is doing.
Tougher laws, too late for both
Mute us.
family and
Person.
I don't want to talk.
Zoom has now changed how Facebook Live works, so I may not run it on Facebook Live. Just because I don't want it synced to my page. So, all right. Think we're about ready to get started. Thank you everyone for your patience this evening. We are over 30 people now, Jen, so that's great. I want to thank everyone for joining us for our 5th week now of the Walloon Lake Reads the Nick Adams stories. I did a little report. We have over 250 people registered collectively for all the various sessions. How many of that is people that are here for everyone? But 250 individual people have signed up for various aspects of this community read. And I've actually had a local group, a library, ask me for the details on what we plan. So they're looking to do something in their own community as well. So that's wonderful. But today we have a very meaty section of the book, 4 stories, but probably more pages perhaps than the other sections combined. And very excited to have Jennifer presenting for us this evening. Jen is secretary currently of the Michigan Hemingway Society. And Jen and I met at the conference a couple of years ago. And then I had the opportunity in the fall of 2017 to go visit her wonderful literary garden located in the courtyard of her school. So I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that at some point this evening as well. But I'm going to let Jen take us through what should be some very deep discussions about some very poignant books or sections of this particular book. So Jen, I'm going to pass that on to you.
Well, thank you, Diana. And yep, Diana and I go back a long way from the first conference that I attended with one of my students who was the first Michigan Hemingway Society Cote Scholarship winner, which is how, well, that's not quite how I got there, but that I will end up talking about because how I got there ends up being part of Summer People. So thank you for coming. And I know everybody's anxiously awaiting the NFL draft, but hopefully I can keep you entertained until that starts. I'm super excited to tackle these 4 stories because they're not often put together, for one thing, and for another reason, because I teach high school. I teach 10th through 12th grade at West Bloomfield High School in West Bloomfield, Michigan, and I've been teaching The End of Something, The 3-Day Blow, and The Big Two-Hearted River for a long time. I do not teach Summer People because of its sexually explicit scene. And that turned out to be quite problematic for Hemingway as well, as I'm going to get to this evening. So I had to do quite a bit of research on that one. And as I've already told Dr. Diker, who is with us tonight, I am very much in debt to him for his scholarship on that particular story. It's going to sound strange, but I'm going to kick off the idea that the first thing that I turned to after rereading the stories, and actually after teaching The Great Gatsby to my sophomores, which I just finished, I turned to the Transcendentalists, which sounds odd because the whole persona of Hemingway, as you know, as I tell the kids all the time, macho man, seems about as far away from Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau as one could possibly get, especially Thoreau, you know, out in the woods, being solitary, being as immersed in nature as possible. But every year that I've taught first the Transcendentalists and then Huck Finn and then gotten to Hemingway, I've recognized that there's been a thread running through those literary movements, and particularly through what the Transcendentalists have had to offer, and then Huck Finn himself, and then in Nick Adams, this idea of retreating into nature, of going into nature for its healing properties, and finding a sense of solace, a sense of peace. One of my favorite lines from Ralph Waldo Emerson is, in the woods, we return to reason and faith. And certainly we see that at play in the Big Two-Hearted River. But the thing that connects the four stories, well, let me back up. I'm not the first person to think of this. There have been connections between Emerson and Hemingway and their shared love of nature. But the comparisons generally stop there because the two men are so very, very different in their outlook, in their philosophy, in the way that they live their lives, in the kind of times that they lived in. With the exception of an essay by Cameron Scott from 2016, who wrote an article called Ernest Hemingway, the Modern Transcendentalist, which was published in Criterion Journal of Literary Criticism. However, I started to consider the way that nature works in all four of these stories after talking with my sophomores about The Great Gatsby and Gatsby himself as a figure who, and forgive me the digression, but who becomes Jay Gatsby on the water when he steps onto Dan Cody's yacht, and then the Jay Gatsby who dies in the water. So we've been talking a lot about water imagery, and I realized that the four stories are not connected by whiskey. They're not connected by women. They're not connected even by war. And Dr. Diker, thank you for pointing this out. They're not even connected by wounding, because in Summer People, nothing bad happens to Nick. It's one of the only Nick Adams stories where nothing bad happens to him and he comes out okay. It's exactly the opposite of every other Nick Adams story that's out there. However, what does connect all four of them is the idea of water and the way that water works in each one of these stories. So this is where I started to think about water as a healing mechanism, or as a mechanism for shedding something in his life, or a transportation, not a transportation, but a way of moving through. I'm thinking of Marge Bump here, moving through a difficult time in his life, a passage in his life. And I started thinking about the ways that that operates in those four stories. Certainly you have the swamp and the rivers in the Big Two-Hearted River. You have the rowboat ride in which he's trying to get up the courage to break up with Marge, and then the rowboat ride when she leaves him. You have the 3-day blow with the storm moving through, which is the same sort of emotional storm that Nick has to go through in order to come to terms with what he's done, the consequences of what he's done. And then in Summer People, you have the spring that opens up the story, and the with the mint, and also the diving and swimming that the friends do off of the dock. And so those images and the way that water works in those 4 stories is, I think, something that I would like to offer as a consideration, and something that hasn't been discussed in anything that I can find in my extensive research. So that is something that I would like to throw out from the get-go.
All right, as in past weeks, if you have a comment or question, feel free to raise your hand, and we will call on folks, or you can put a question or comment down in the chat as well. Just like last week, if people are a little shy to get going. All right. Jen, maybe if you want to share with us some added comment, you mentioned the story that brought you to Hemingway and to Northern Michigan.
Oh. Well, that started with the literary garden. So speaking of nature and speaking of the transcendentalists, I was inspired in the fall of 2014 to create a literary garden at my high school. And the idea was that I would start asking houses and museums and the homes of authors and their museums if there were any plants on the property that were left from when the authors lived there. And if there were, could we get seeds? Could we get cuttings? Could we get transplants of those plants? Because I knew that financially there was never any way that I was going to get my students to those literary locations, but could there be a way that I could bring a piece of their nature to our courtyard, which was neglected and overgrown at that point? And so I started calling in the Northeast I started with the Transcendentalists. I started in Concord, and I was fortunate enough to get some early yeses. And one of the early yeses that I got was from the Walt Whitman birthplace in New York. And they gave us a lilac root that was about this big. And that lilac now is taller than I am. But it took 18 months of nurturing it on a windowsill. And actually, I didn't nurture it. One of our secretaries, who is just tremendous and kind and patient, took to that lilac and babied it until it was ready to be moved outside. When I went out to Concord, the Old Manse folks were so generous and really were the ones who started our garden. And they provided us with a tremendous amount of plants, and it sort of spiraled from there. But I ended up with Ernest Hemingway's Horton Bay mint, because that is the mint, that the close growing mint that's mentioned in the spring, in the beginning of Summer People, that Nick is drinking from and wanting to plunge himself into, I think, as and Dr. Decker mentioned as well, as a way of cleansing himself from some impure thoughts that he has towards Kate. I see the question about the big Twohearted River. What's really going on beyond a recognition of the peace found in nature? I did some research on this, and it's something that I talk about with my students. Hemingway himself said in an article that he, oh gosh, I'll have to pull the article, it's sitting in here, but he said himself that the big Twohearted River was about a soldier who was returning home from war and trying to get past the war, but that he left the war out. There's plenty of war in the story, and in Hemingway's words, there's plenty of Indians in the story, and he just left them out because you as a reader should be able to discern all of the things that Nick is carrying.
Any other thoughts from the group on while we're talking about the Two-Hearted River, um, and some of the elements from that particular story.
I can throw out something funny that I found out when I was researching. So when I was researching more for the Two-Hearted River, I found out that, and actually Bells, and whether or not Bells Two-Hearted is named after the Two-Hearted, the Hemingway story, I ran across a blog and found out, to my delight, that trout actually have two hearts, which is really interesting. One of the things that Hemingway said about choosing that, there's, you know, a recognition that he chose a different name for the river so that he could hide his secret fishing spot and no one could ruin it, which is something that he references in the story about people always ruining things for you and touching the trout and giving the trout fungus if they didn't know what they were doing, which is something that's echoed later in Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. We know that the two of them met up during World War II. But here is something: trout actually have two hearts. And what's even more interesting than that is that the second heart is believed to only be active when fish are swimming, suggesting it is reserved for times when fish are active and in need of more oxygen. So the second heart, which is called the caudal heart, is kind of like an oxygen mask dropping down when I, the author of the blog, crank the treadmill up a little higher. So when I started to think about that, I started to think about how, with Nick coming home from war, is in need of a sort of oxygen mask like the trout, and is needing a little extra to process the trauma of war. And so I thought, what a perfect symbol for a man who is like the grasshoppers, blackened over from his war wounds and needs the caudal heart. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to kick in like an oxygen mask and give him a little extra, to keep going when he is suffering and trying to move past, heal, find solace, and sort of find renewal.
All right, this is the quietest this group has been. So I know some of our key people were not able to make it this evening. So we're gonna need some of the rest of you to step up and start having some conversations about the Two-Hearted River, or the end of something, or the 3-day blow, or summer people. There we go, Don.
Hello.
Thank you.
Great, I'll come right down. Thank you very much.
All right,
Okay.
Don, go ahead. Go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Jennifer, I'd like to ask you a question about the ordering of the stories. Okay,
Okay.
Does it make sense to you in Philip Young's ordering that Big Two-Hearted River comes before the end of something or the 3-day blow?
No.
And let me ask you why that occurs to me. At the end of the 3-day blow, Nick says something. Let's see. I'm going to quote it so I can get it right. This is about Nick toward the end of the 3-day blow. He felt happy. Nothing was finished. Nothing was ever lost. He would go into town on Saturday. He felt lighter, as he had just before Bill started to talk about it. There was always a way out. So this is my problem, is that Nick here says there's always a way out. Nothing was ever lost. But if you're right, and I think you are, that Big Two-Hearted River is coming back from the war, we know there had been lost. I mean, you cannot be in a war without seeing loss, without seeing people killed in front of you, or without seeing romantic relationships destroyed. And so it seems that putting Big Twohearted River before these two Nick and Marjorie stories just doesn't make sense to me. What about you?
So Don, I'm curious because I have a copy of In Our Time in front of me, and I also have a copy of Nick Adams
And it's got rest.
in front of me. And which ordering are we talking about?
Jennifer, I'm talking not, and In Our Time, you're absolutely right. Those two Marge stories come well before Big Two-Hearted River.
Right.
But in the book that we're following, the Nick Adams stories that Philip Young organized under Section 4.
Yeah, I have no idea what Philip Young was thinking. It makes absolutely no sense, and I don't know why he has it as a soldier home.
I never went down this way.
None of it makes any sense
Or did
whatsoever. It doesn't follow chronologically. It doesn't follow in terms of development. It doesn't follow in terms of his actions. It doesn't follow in terms. Big Two-Hearted River is so out of order in that section that I wouldn't even teach it this way, Don. I have no idea why it's like that. Do you have any guesses?
No, I don't. I think I don't know. I mean, I think Philip Young is trying to organize the stories chronologically with reference to the biography of Ernest Hemingway. And that's why the two Marge stories comes late, because biographically,
The trip to
Ernest Hemingway meets Marge after Ernest Hemingway, the soldier, has returned from Italy. So he meets Marge in 1919 and 1920 after he's gotten back from the war. But in those stories, he acts like a kid. He acts like as if the war was never there, and he seems to be a kid living with his parents, just as Bill, his friend, is living in his father's house and has to be careful about the liquor, because if I'm not, Dad's going to be mad at me.
Right. And the other thing is that if I'm not mistaken, the trip to Sini happened before he went off to war. Did it not? I don't have the biography in front of me, but I'm almost positive that that's the case.
It was his last trip up there was 1919, I believe, but I'm not sure. He took other trips.
Don, do you remember?
I think I might, Jennifer. I think that the trip up north was one of the last things that Ernest Hemingway did after enlisting in the Red Cross, but before he had to go to New York to leave. Right. So
Yep, I thought I had just looked that up before we sat down to do this. So yeah, that makes complete sense in terms of a biographical, but not in terms of the way that he writes it. And you know what? Summer People makes no sense either, because that story, as you pointed out, has a number of chronological issues in terms of references to prohibition, references to automobiles, and those things wouldn't have been, my understanding from reading your work, that was a hard one even for Hemingway himself to place, because of the way he writes it is about a later Hemingway, and yet it's recalling an earlier summer. So he had a lot of trouble negotiating even where to put it, which is why it didn't end up in Our Time. He kept trying to rewrite it. He kept trying to hide everybody's identities. There were chronological issues involved in it. And so it doesn't make any sense.
Somebody had a question, in the chat about Larry Bell or Bell's Brewery. And it's interesting, if you go to the Bell's website, Two-Hearted Ale was released in 1992. And on the website, it does say that it was named after the Two-Hearted River, but makes no reference to Hemingway or Nick Adams.
I actually did some research on this today, Diana, and I have a call pending in with Bells, but they didn't return it before I I got on tonight. After you posted the picture today, with the
Oh, the fly rod and the beer?
yeah, I thought, oh no, I better know what I'm talking about. So I, pulled on my journalist hat, my Nancy Drew hat, and I called over there. And I did get an interesting phone call, or I had an interesting phone call from or with a woman at the who answered the phone, and she said there is a story, and there is a woman that she tried to get me in contact with today who said there's definitely a connection with Hemingway. And I was anxiously awaiting that that phone call back. I had my daughter on the phone when I was doing some research in case the phone rang, but I didn't get to get the rest of that story. So if I can get an update, I'll be sure to share it on the Walloon Lake page.
Yeah, and I didn't think I want to think that I have asked Larry Bell that question before, but we may have been drinking at the time, and so I don't recall what his answer was to that. But now they also have Lighthearted, which is a lighter version of Two-Hearted. For those of you who don't care for the IPA, which I am not a fan of. Two-Hearted I could do a little bit of, but I think there may be even some issues with they can clearly put the Two-Hearted River on their marketing. Putting Hemingway on it is not, and Nick Adams would be something that would require approval from the Hemingway Foundation. And there's a lot more legality involved in claiming that that came from that. Now, that doesn't mean that Larry may come out and say, well, I'm a fan and I read the books and part of that. But in terms of their actual marketing, you can't really do that because there would be those issues that you have to clear through the Hemingway Foundation.
Yes, there would be all of that. And it may have been inspired, and they may not want to say that in fear of having to pay royalties.
Exactly.
So that, that might all be an issue as well. But yeah, they would not, like I said, I didn't, maybe I'll get some sort of an answer tomorrow after this is aired. Maybe they didn't want to give me an answer
Well,
before.
and the royalty part may be very real because the Pilar Rum Company is endorsed by the Hemingway Foundation, and that they pay heavily for that signature and that name. So
I do know that the beer was named in part after the two hops that balance out the flavor. I did do the research on that. I did see
there was another question. You see that one from Kathleen?
that yes, bony fish like salmon have a two-chambered heart. This muscular organ circulates blood throughout the body and is part of the circulatory system. Yes, I did see that there were other fish that have two hearts as well, but we know that Hemingway did love his trout fishing. I would recommend taking a look at the blog. It's called A Brook Trout Blog. And on that blog, there is reference to Bell's Two-Hearted Ale, which that's where I found the really interesting background on the trout.
Right.
There's someone else.
Yeah, there's another couple questions down there.
Well, they're a little bit earlier. Oh, I was taught that water represented a female. Yes, Robert, that comes up a lot in the literary criticism for the Big Two-Hearted River. There is a lot of material that talks about the swamp representing the female, representing the representing female genitalia, representing a womb, representing his complicated relationship with women, representing the mother, representing his complicated relationship with Grace. I don't, there is a whole lot of criticism out there that talks about that. I don't tend to get into that in my high school classes. And I'm not so certain how I think about that. I tend to think of it more as being the subconscious, the tangled, where you see a clear river with Hemingway and him looking down into the water and watching the trout trying to study themselves and knowing that he's trying to study himself. And knowing that Hemingway himself said that the story was about the war and about the Indians. I see the swamp in the big Twohearted River representing more of the idea of all of the horrible things that he saw in war, and some of the things that he documents from, say, like the story Indian Camp, the very early traumas that he witnessed. That is, I think, more, in line, but it's not without its realm of possibility. Water, that also fits in with the mermaid business in Summer People. I started to think about the spring, and because we grow the mint from Horton's Bay in the literary garden, and we talk about that spring. I took my kids up to Petoskey to experience Hemingway country. I had talked about the spring in my notes, and I thought about the spring as being this really life-giving force and representing northern Michigan for Hemingway. I said, this was more to myself than anything, but in my own notes, I said that perhaps he knew that northern Michigan was the spring, the elixir from where his source bubbled forth, spouting up from the spring, so cold he couldn't keep his hand there. That eternal spring, that idyllic existence, the best summer. Hold on, let me quote from his unpublished or his unsent letter to Marge. The best summer there ever, got started remembering that summer of 1919, best I've ever had. This was crossed out and changed to best summer there ever was, I guess. Not going to spoil that summer or fall for anybody. It was idyllic, perfect as some days in spring are, and mountain valleys you pass on puffing trains and other impermanent things. And I said, the spring in northern Michigan where the mint grows acted as his source. It was the source from where his writing came. It was the source that he drew on again and again and again, coming back to it even in A Movable Feast, coming back to, and I think he was afraid. That's why he only returned, as far as we know, to Petoskey once. He never wanted to exhaust the reserves of northern Michigan, because that's where he thought that he left, I think, the best of him. Even working with the Marge Bump letters, there is an indication that in the last days of his life that he, I mean, and it's secondhand, but, or even third hand, but the idea that in some ways he wished he had never left Petoskey, that was where he was happiest.
Real quick, Jen, before we, I was gonna say, before we get to the next set of questions, real quick, since you just brought up Marge, do you want to fill everybody in real quick on the project that you're working on with your students?
Sure. So the Michigan Hemingway Society owns letters that Marge Bump exchanged, the real Marge Bump, exchanged with a bookseller from 1966 to the 1980s, where she told him, he basically started interviewing her about her relationship with Hemingway 5 years after Hemingway's death. And her family had published this book, Pip Pip to Hemingway, in an attempt to clear her name, which was butchered pretty badly after Hemingway left her real name in the story. It so bothered her that it haunted her for the rest of her life. She moved out of Michigan. And it wasn't actually that Hemingway had treated her at all badly. And Dr. Diker has spoken about this at our Hemingway conference. Dr. Stoneback has written about it extensively as well. And there's a real turn in the scholarship with both of their work to talk about how she's portrayed as a very strong and victorious woman who is much more adult than Nick is. But Marge really didn't live long enough, I think, to see the sea change in the scholarship. Critics and biographers were very harsh and made her out to be some sort of town tart or, horror or something like that. And, it really damaged her reputation, and she felt the need to escape the confines of Petoskey and live elsewhere. She did not admit to new friends that she knew Hemingway, but she did stay in correspondence with him. She burned all of his letters long before her death. She didn't want to leave them behind. But these letters that we have that she exchanged with the bookseller in New Hampshire tell her side of the story. And so my students, who this would never normally happen, normally this would be something that PhD students would be working on. My high school students have been working one letter at a time to transcribe the correspondence between Donald St. John and Marge Bump to provide a searchable digital database for researchers who are interested in learning more about Marge. Yep, there's the picture. There's Marge.
Picture that exists of her, because it's the only one I've ever seen.
No, there is another one of her where, so when Ernest returned home from the war, he gave her his Red Cross medal. And there is a picture of her wearing that Red Cross medal. And you can see that on Central Michigan University's Clark Library website.
What's interesting about this picture of her is this is definitely his style. I mean, she has a resemblance to Hadley.
Yes.
She's kind of
both had red
thick,
hair,
curvy, the short hair.
Yep. It's almost uncanny. I wish I had pulled a picture of Hadley, but yes.
All right. So real quick, I'm going to go back up to some questions. And then we'll kind of go down the list. One, did Hemingway try to publish Summer People and fail because of its content, or did he just, for whatever reason, decide not to publish it?
To my knowledge, he just yanked it and never, he said that there was no way to publish it without hurting people that he loved, which is so contradictory to what he published with Marge. But I think, and I'm going to just add to the chorus of voices here, including Don's, that I think that he thought that he was portraying Marge in a positive light. And I think he knew that publishing Summer People was going to make a lot of people in that story very unhappy. I think that when he published A 3-Day Blow and made Marge's mother look poor, look mean or look, self-serving, he didn't really think about her mother's feelings. But I think he thought he did right by Marge and was sorry that she took it the wrong way.
And it's interesting that he was concerned about what people thought on that one, but in other stories, he doesn't really care what people think
Oh
or who
no,
he
when it
hurts.
came to Fitzgerald, he didn't care.
All right. All right, Rob. Well, if we're coming to your property in Horton Bay, you could cook us something with that barbecue sauce. I mean, I'm just saying, in case we get hungry over there. Rob Miller, who's been with us during, I think, almost every week, has a place in Horton Bay. Are you moving there permanently? Is that maybe? Well, anyway, in any case, we hope to see you on the caravan tour on May 13th. Another question, Patrick. I wonder if Hemingway used Nick Adams to express a thought that came to him throughout his life rather than trying to make these stories fit into neat chronological order.
There's an idea that they create a sort of loose novel. And, you know, if you read In Our Time, and I'm sure Dr. Diker can speak to this as well, if you read In Our Time, as opposed to the Nick Adams stories, they are set in a certain order with vignettes in between them. And the Nick Adams stories loses that. And so I think that you almost have to, if you want a better answer to that question, Patrick, I would encourage you to read In Our Time. Here's In Our Time. Oh, by the way, it's taken from the Bible verse, "Give us peace in our time," which is why I have that up here. But I would encourage you to read In Our Time, which the structure is different. And then the little vignettes in between, which detail pieces of the war, give you a different perspective on how Hemingway himself wanted it structured. And so I think that that's important to note, is that the Philip Young version from 72 orders them completely differently, which is why Dr. Diker and I were having that conversation. It doesn't make any sense to put the Big Two-Hearted River in that order.
Did anyone ever interview Philip Young at the time to question why he chose to put them in this particular order?
Yes, I believe that he said what Dr. Diker said, is that he tried to put them in order from age, and using Hemingway's biography and using details in the story, tried to put them in order, but it doesn't always work out very well.
Well, much like we've talked in previous weeks, you know, Hemingway takes places and moves them around, and that isn't just physical locales, it's periods of time and memories from specific
and
periods of time.
memories, I think, yes. And then he conflates people, and he conflates details like automobiles or like prohibition, and they don't always line up.
Kathleen has a question for the Big Two-Hearted River. Why is it divided into two parts?
You know, there is a vignette in Our Time. There is a vignette in between the two of them. So that was a deliberate move by Hemingway. And it's the vignette in the Big Two-Hearted River that divides the two of them is not one probably that anybody has seen in a long time, because I don't know who picks up In Our Time.
I have my copy.
Yeah, so
I've kept them together, I found, and that would have been a good suggestion at the beginning. I think that's a recommendation I'll give to other groups that do this, is to have In Our Time with you so that you can do some of those comparisons.
yeah, so the vignette that comes between them is about a hanging. Let me see if I can get a quick summary rather than read the whole thing, because I have my materials here. Hold on one second. So here's the summary. Several men are brought to be hanged at 6 a.m. at the county jail. All of the men are frightened, black and white. Cardinella is carried to the gallows. He refuses to stand. A pair of priests accompany him. One of them tells Cardinella to be a man and stand. When the guards approach him with the hood, Cardinella defecates. The guards are disgusted and tell him to get him a chair to sit in since he will not stand. A priest kneels next to Cardinella just before the drop falls. That's a pretty jarring vignette in between the two sections. The other thing is that Nick goes from being in a good place in the big Two-Hearted River where he does find some solace to starting to lose his nerve, to shaking, to my students find it in the story, the turning point in the story where he loses his nerve, his hands are shaking, hooking the trout, getting scared, sick, looking at it. There is a shift in tone in the story in part 2. And so my suspicion is that's why the story is broken up like that. I see that Dr. Diker's hand is up. I'm wondering.
Oh, it's up from earlier. He just never put it down.
I know, but Don, did you want to talk about the vignette and in our time and why Big Two-Hearted is divided like that?
Just a possible thought. The two parts, the first part I would call preparation, and the second part I would call confrontation. I think this is a test for Nick that he passes with flying colors. I think it's a brilliant story. A lot of people, as you know, Jen, think it's his best,
Yes.
and that he wanted to conclude in our time with it, not only because it fit chronologically, but because it was the best. He wanted to end with the best. And one of the ways I think you can see that at the beginning of the story, Nick is seated. He's seated on his baggage that was thrown off the moving train by the baggage car. And at the very end of the the last paragraph of the story begins with Nick stood up. And I
Yes.
think, I think that's the progress of the story. Nick is moving forward. He's passed the test. He's ready to go on. And although there's critical debate about this, Jen, I'd be interested to see what you and Diana think. At the end of the story, when Nick says there were plenty of days to fish the swamp, there are some critics who say that will never happen. I'm one of the people who believes it will happen. I believe that it's that Nick has passed the test, but maybe the bigger one, the larger one, the more dangerous one, the more risky one in the swamp is still to come, but he's going to do it. So that's why I think that Big Two-Hearted River is, perhaps the most affirmative short story Hemingway ever wrote, certainly among, I would say, the most affirmative. What do you think?
I've had the pleasure of reading a lot of your work as of late, but I would agree with you because you talk about a couple of phrases that are so key to Hemingway, one of them being shot to hell or gone to hell, and another being she stood up, he stood up. You talk about that with the end of something and how powerful that is for Marge. She stood up. You talk about that in the Big Two-Hearted River. And when you spot it in the Nick Adams stories, it is a moment, and it happens in Summer People as well. And so when you start to see it and you see that pattern, it's like when you spot a pattern in Poe, and in Poe, it's usually something terrible is happening, right? As soon as the clock is striking midnight, something bad is about to go down, is what I always tell my students. But I had not noticed that pattern until you pointed it out. And then I realized that yes, for Nick, and I don't know if it continues through all of Hemingway's fiction, but certainly in the Nick Adams stories, it's very much you know, a moment of reckoning, a moment of forward movement. And so, you know, when Marjorie stands up, she's moving on into a life, you know, and no, I don't need you to, I not needed for you to push me off. I've got this, right? And so I think that I 100% agree with your assessment of that.
Okay, so we're going to go back to the chat. Jill asks, what do you make of the talk of Chesterton in the 3-Day Blow? Seems odd for Hemingway.
Well, I was not prepared to talk about Chesterton, so you're gonna have to give me a minute on that. If we could go to Patrick for just a second.
Yes.
Have read all of it. When did he write it? Which
So clearly In Our Time would give you any of the stories that are in there were written in the 20s because that was published in the 20s.
Yes, and I can be more specific about which story if Patrick, if you could tell me which one we're talking about. In Our Time was published in 1925, but some of them were published a little earlier. There was a Paris edition of In Our Time that was all lowercase, published in 1924.
Which was for sale on eBay recently for $50,000 or some insane thing.
Oh my gosh.
The first, like one of the first few editions.
Wow.
Yeah. I didn't buy it.
What? With
I've
your
got-
millions? I can't.
Yeah, I know, right?
I can't believe that.
Yeah, so you know, I think whether it's this time or next week, I'd like to dig a little bit more into some of these In Our Time, the little vignettes and such. But Patrick and anyone else, I mean, if you have that copy or get it, you can pull the list. And I'm actually working with, I told Chris Struble, I actually want to put a list, or maybe Don, you already have one, of the stories and which one was written first and where they were published. I'd like to have a full list of all of these Nick Adams stories, just so that I know when they all were written, when they were all published, and then because there's most of these have been published before, a handful have not.
It's a very complicated list, Diana.
Yes.
I've been trying to work on it, and it's not an easy. It's super complicated, and it's when was it published in Europe, and when was it published in America? Which In Our Time was it published in?
Right.
When did he write it? Did he hold it? I mean, Don, you know what it's like tracing that publication history just for the Nick Adams stories, much less anything else.
Right.
It's like going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, and I was just before we started this series, I was actually doing a lot of that research because a handful of stories had been in other short story collections. And so I was trying to get my head around where they had all shown up previously, and then got all turned around and backwards and gave up the project. So I need to revisit it a little bit.
I wanted to say one thing. And the Michigan Hemingway Society, which I've been a part of for many years, used to try to do more trips than we have been doing lately. And we did make a trip up to Seney and to the Fox River. In fact, Lorian Hemingway was our speaker that time, and she was a fly fisher person, so she had some things to add to that, although I don't know if you've ever met her. She also is a little different, like a lot of the Hemingways. So, but being in that place, and then I don't know if Fred is the one that read a little one part of the Twohearted, but when you have that actual story and those words spoken in the place where they were envisioned, where Hemingway envisioned them, it is such a remarkable experience. The end of something we experienced also. We went, sat on the end of the dock and had somebody read that. And you are right there. So there's something about the universality of a lot of these Nick Adams stories that is so appealing always. I mean, yes, the trees are different from what they were when Hemingway wrote the story or when he experienced that incident, that fictional incident. But you are at the same place, and there's something about the nature that you really can get from hearing that story read and knowing that you are there. So I would recommend that to anybody who really wants to feel the impact of some of these short stories, is to try to go to the place where they take place. It's just an experience that can't be equaled.
Nancy, I couldn't agree with you more, because when I took my kids up there, it was the same thing. They had read The End of Something. They had read The 3-Day Blow. They had read just the first paragraph of Summer People, because we couldn't read any more than that. But, and they plunged their hands into spring, and they, it was May, so the mint had come up and it was a beautiful warm day. And that's what they kept telling me. And they walked around Petoskey and saw all of the plaques that the Michigan Hemingway Society had installed. And for them, it was just an incredible experience of place-based learning. So even though I had brought the mint into our courtyard, it wasn't the same as being there. And I've tried you try your best, to give them a sense, but to walk in his footsteps and to do the things that he describes, you can't replicate it.
I don't know any other author that, there probably are some, that I've never had that experience with other authors on being in the place where they wrote something and having it give you such a wonderful spiritual feeling almost.
The only other one I can compare it to is being at Walden Pond. And
you're right.
Which
I was there, and you're right. That is true.
Yep, I guess that's why I'm drawing parallels between, that faith in nature. But I think that for Hemingway, you can't call him a transcendentalist, because, like in Summer People and Dr. Diker made such a good case for it. That's an arrogant Nick Adams in Summer People. That's a Nick Adams that knows things and is better than everybody else and doesn't experience any sort of wounding in that story, and everything works out for him. Everything is fine. He doesn't have any sort of trauma in that story. And so he's got all the material and success with women that he could possibly want. And so that's where you don't see so much of a transcendental Nick Adams. You see one that's very rooted in the material world, with material desires and physical desires that are not so spiritual and not so transcendent.
Right. Well, and the person who really is good on all that too is Ken Merrick, who's part of our society. And Ken was the person who originally wrote. We had a guidebook before the days of plaques and the internet and all that. We had a guidebook that Ken had written about the different places, and he worked a lot with Christopher Struble too, and took him different places. And so Ken's research is just, incomparable. He will not ever say anything out loud unless he has documented the proof for it. But he has a very good inside picture, especially of anything to do with the fishing, any of the fishing stories. So I recommend everybody, if you can, come to the conference and listen to some of these people talk, or just, go to have a drink with them afterwards and listen to them talk, because I think that some of the Michigan Hemingway Society members are not all scholars. Bill used to say there were the three levels. There were the scholars, and then there were the knowledgeables, and then there were the hangers-on. And the hangers-on were there so that we could ask the questions so that the knowledgeables and the scholars could answer them. But so all the members of that society, especially those of us who've been around for a while, are not scholars. There are a couple, but a lot of us have become more knowledgeable than we were when we started with it. And every year, maybe every 5 years, okay, we do this story again with a different speaker, and you get a different little slant on it. And it's just a wonderful experience. And our culture is changing today, and people do not go to conferences based on authors that often like they used to. It just doesn't happen. But this is one of the great experiences. We get people from all over the country who come to this because this is where it happened. And we try to always focus on Hemingway in Michigan and Michigan and Hemingway. So we are doing Native American focus this next year. And there are always people who say, well, why don't you do something on Hemingway in Cuba? Well, Cuba isn't very close to Michigan. So we'll let other people do that. But so anyhow, that's my invitation to come.
I second that. And as somebody who was originally a hanger-on,
We all were.
I have become much more knowledgeable in the last I think it's been 5 or 6 years now, and have grown so much and have passed on what I've learned to my students. So it's a widening circle.
Good.
Kind of like Nick in Indian camp.
Yeah.
We're in the water. See,
Yeah.
I learned
Yes.
a few things.
Nope. Catherine.
Hi. Yeah, I don't know how to do the electronic hand raising. Sorry, but
Hi, Catherine.
hey, Jen, how are you? You're doing
How are
great.
you?
It's really good to see you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to jump off what you said about your bringing your students from West Bloomfield up here. So I'm also a high school teacher, and when I taught the Nick Adams stories in Chicago, it was a whole different experience. And I used to teach in Chicago, but I now live here in Northern Michigan, and I teach at Boyne City High School. So what's interesting about the difference? So you brought your kids here so they could see it. And I never was able to do that with my Chicago kids, unfortunately. But when I'm teaching the Nick Adams stories to these Boyne City kids, they're just an instant recognition. And if anything, they're telling me about their experiences. So we actually just read Big Two-Hearted River, and they're talking about when they fished in the UP and when they took their kayak down the Fox River. And, they just have this instant connection because they've lived this life. They've seen the plaques all over Walloon and everywhere in Petoskey, and they just take it for granted. Like, oh yeah, Hemingway. It's like, he's just this dude that, spent his summers here like a million other people that come to Northern Michigan. And, and these are kids that work with summer people that have to, deal with them at Bay Harbor Yacht Club and everything. So these are kids that get the whole idea of summer people. They're like, oh yeah, those people. So, it's a whole different experience to teach Northern Michigan kids the Hemingway Northern Michigan stories, because they relate to him, and then they also get contemptuous of the fact that, oh, well, he was a summer person, so it's just, it kind of is, it's interesting, to have that dynamic. But while I've got everybody, I've been thinking a lot about what everyone's thinking about as to why, and what Don asked as to why Big Two-Hearted River is before those other stories in the Nick Adams stories. And so, so when we think about his summer before he went away to war, which was July 1918, I'm thinking that is when he did all those fun adventures with the summer people, with Kate and with Marge and with Odger, and he was a younger, more immature person, but because the last time he was in Petoskey was 1919, and it was actually after the war. So he comes back to Petoskey to write because he can't stand being in Oak Park anymore. Oak Park has become too provincial. He doesn't want to be under the thumb of his parents. So he comes to Petoskey to write. He gets that little room on State Street, that little boarding house. And he does see Kate in the fall and the winter. And I think Chris even said in one of the Michigan Hemingway Society things that he had spent some Christmas time with Kate and her family. And then when you look at the 3-day blow, it says the rain stopped, and this was the fall, so this wasn't summer. So I always used to think of it as, okay, well, this was after the end of something. He breaks up with her, it was the end of summer, and now it's fall, and they're talking about it. But I think
Do you mean Kate or Marge?
Marge.
Okay.
So he in the 3-day blow, it's fall, because he did spend fall and winter in Petoskey. He wrote through the fall and the winter. So I think what Philip must have been thinking was that, okay, he comes home from the war and then he goes back to Petoskey and he sees these people again. So I think he thinks that some of these things may have happened after the war, maybe the 3-day blow, because of the fact that it's fall. But the other summer stories, I think everybody's right in thinking that was an earlier Nick. That was a less tainted Nick. But maybe because of the way we all know that his last time in Petoskey was 1919, Philip thinks, okay, well, these had to happen in 1919. And so I think that might be one of the reasons why they're after.
But you've got to remember that he wrote these in Paris
Right.
after all this. And so he used his memory and his, it's fiction.
Right.
So I think he moved things around. We don't really know how he did some of these things, because when he wrote them, he was using the incidents and the people that he had lived with at that time to write stories. And he's not in that, he's not chronologically in Petoskey.
No, and I don't
think at all.
Yeah, I don't think he ever meant them to be chronological. I think with Philip trying to put them together, but we're trying to figure out why Philip Young put those where they were. I think he was just trying to think, okay, well, he was at war in 1918, but the last time he was in Petoskey was 1919, but he didn't really think about the content of the stories, is what I'm thinking.
Well,
Yeah.
and the other thing is that he's idealized this particular time in his life because he's in Paris and Hadley's lost the suitcase, and then she gets pregnant, and then they're in the tiny apartment and Bumby's screaming and he's trying to write, and it's miserable there for a while. And that's before he meets Pauline and starts that whole mess. And so I think it's easy to idealize, hanging out with your friends in the summer and, being in northern Michigan and not having all of those responsibilities,
Right.
Because that, hot, cramped apartment with a baby screaming is, no fun for anybody, not any one of those people involved. So, better to, write these tales and conflate memories, and I think that that's part of it. It's escapism.
Right. But if I can ask one more geographical question. So when I teach end of something to my Northern Michigan kids, when I taught it in Chicago, I always just kind of assumed the lake that they were rowing across was Walloon Lake. And this was before I really got to be much of a Hemingway scholar. It's like, oh yeah, he summered on Walloon Lake, so that was part of the lake. But the kids up here tell me, okay, he's talking about the point and he's talking about it being near Horton Bay. They said that's got to be Lake Charlevoix, and they start pointing out where they think the point is, which is over by the
Charlevoix.
ferries. Yeah, so it's Lake Charlevoix.
It's
So
Charlevoix.
yeah, so that's what. So then I started to realize that once I started coming up here myself, I'm like, well, yeah, it's got to be Lake Charlevoix. So, but I think a lot of people teach it where it's Walloon Lake, if they don't know the geographic region. So that's what's also great. What you're saying, Nancy, is that more teachers that teach Hemingway need to come up here, because then they can actually picture what he's talking about. So, but yeah, they totally get it when he says that she gets the boat and he has to walk back. They know how far it's going to be for him to walk, because they know it. They've seen it.
Catherine, I read a beautiful piece of literary criticism that said that she tells him, you can walk around the point because he's been walking around the point of breaking up with her.
Exactly.
Story. And I love telling the kids that I walked around their desks and I said, you just keep walking around the point, Nick. Just keep walking around the
Yep.
point.
It's
And
like poetic justice. Yeah.
yeah, the kids were cracking up. Yeah.
That's
yeah.
great. I'm going to use that one. That's great.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yep.
Okay, so Jen, did you come up with an answer for the Chesterton question?
No, I mean, other than, the British author comparison, I'm not really familiar. Don, do you want to weigh in on that? Because I didn't do any research into that and it's not my field of expertise.
I don't have much to say about it, Jen, except the conversation suggests suggests a couple of things. First of all, Nick and Bill are both readers. We know this. One of the earliest times we see Nick in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, he's outside against a tree reading a book, and throughout, Nick is a reader. The other thing is, I mean, what I like about the 3-Day Blow is that you've got two kids who are adolescents who are trying to pretend they're adults. There are boys who are trying to pretend that they are men, so they can talk about sports and they can talk about drinking and they can talk about authors.
Highfalutin British authors.
Right, exactly. But the irony is, I mean, it's only when Bill says something you were right, about the Marge business that then they get into an adult topic. They get into an adult topic about relationships and love and breaking up and how do you recover. So, but about Chesterton himself, I don't have much to say except he's for drinking. The little episode from The Flying In. What you refuse is anything other than alcohol. If they're going to give you, water or soda or juice, spit it out and, tell them to take a flying hike. So
Love it.
that's about all I have to say, Jen.
Well, that sums it up for me, Don.
William, you have been very patient. If you want to address the group.
Yeah, well, regarding the chronology and what age Nick was in different stories, a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, 3-Day Blow is possibly my favorite short story of all time. And when I really sort of got into it was sort of my late teens and early 20s. And I feel like that is, probably sort of because that is sort of the age that I think Nick could have been in that story. However, I also wanted to, I was also wondering or wanted to posit if maybe the breakdown of the relationship, at least in the end of something, if maybe that is the point that is trying to be conveyed, is that the breakdown of the relationship was a result of trauma from the war. I think in high school, when this story was read in when I read this in high school, that was sort of how it was presented to me. And there's a lot of symbolism of like, things breaking down and, how Hortons Bay used to be a lumbering town. And
the ruins of yep, I can see where you're saying that. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that pretty much was, I had finished. So yeah, I'm just wondering what you all think about that.
I can see where you would have had an instructor that would have presented it like that. And he did write it post-war. So it's not, it stands to reason that he could have incorporated the imagery of war into the story. I don't teach it like that, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. I mean, kind of like in the Big Two-Hearted River, there's no mention of the war or the Indians, but that doesn't mean that they're, and I'm quoting Hemingway, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. They're throughout the story is what he says. And actually, now that you say that, it's interesting that in a story about the breakup of this woman, or this breakup with Marge, that there is no mention of war, and in a story about war there is no mention of women. Like, is there something also in the woods that he's not mentioning? Is there something more in the story of the breakup that he's not mentioning in that omission?
Yeah, because one of the my favorite things about 3 Day Blow is how much is subtext. It's such a I would say masterclass in subtext, and I just love that, how you can tell he's thinking all these things that are so counter to what he's saying. So yeah, I feel like that could be a part of what's at play here.
Yeah, I feel like I need to go back and reread the story again. I love that reading of it, and I think that there's a lot of potential in there. I'm going to have to take that back to my students this week and see what they think.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
go ahead.
so I think probably the way that I look at it is in a weird sort of way that doesn't conform to the actual rules of time and the universe. The end of something comes after the war and comes maybe after Big Two-Hearted River, but somehow the 3 Day Blow is after that breakup, but Nick is younger and he hasn't been to war yet. Just because these stories weren't necessarily written with a clear chronology in mind, that's sort of the way I would reconcile those things. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't create a clear timeline, but that's sort of, I sort of wonder if that was sort of what Hemingway was thinking when he wrote these individual stories.
I would have to go back and try to track down which month, which week, which date he wrote all of them, how they poured out of them. That would be an interesting little expedition, and a tough one too.
Yeah.
To see if there's anything to that, but I'm pretty sure that the end of something came first and the 3 Day Blow followed, and that both were written prior to the Big Two-Hearted River. The Big Two-Hearted River was published in May of 1925, a month after The Great Gatsby came out. He had been reading Fitzgerald's drafts before he completed The Big Two-Hearted River.
And certainly to a certain extent, 3 Day Blow sort of has to follow chronologically after the end of something. That only makes sense, but still there are things that also don't seem to work with that. So I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much. There's been a lot of great conversation once again. As we prepare for next week, Catherine is going to be hosting the final section, Company of Two, a very commemorative year to be presenting Wedding Day, as we actually have the 100th anniversary of that wedding coming up in September. Catherine, do you have any thoughts for folks as they prepare to read these last 5 short stories for next week?
Yes, actually. So if you've never read the vignette on writing, or even if you have, there is a paragraph where, and this is Nick in the persona as a writer. And so we so clearly see Hemingway in this vignette. But Nick says on page 238 of the Nick Adams stories that Nick in the stories was never himself. He made up he made him up, of course. He had never seen an Indian woman having a baby. That's what made it good. Nobody knew that. So it's kind of goes against like that first session we had with Indian Camp, where people are like, yeah, he definitely must have seen that baby. And, you know, and I'd like to think he did too, but here's Hemingway himself as Nick saying, no, he never saw that. So, so my question is, and so these stories are very personal, these ones that are coming at the end with Wedding Day, and then the two stories about snow and mountains and stuff. If you've read any Hemingway early biographies, a lot of the stuff is super personal and super tied to his actual life. So when I read this, though, I want to ask myself, and I know there's people in this chat, in this room, that are scholars, but some that are more interested in Hemingway's life than his work, and then vice versa. But I want to ask everyone, when you're reading these Nick Adams stories, these last ones, can we ever read them and divorce Hemingway's life from them? Can we just read them as a story about a guy named Nick? Is that possible? So think about that as you're reading them.
Wow, that's a big challenge for us all, Catherine.
But there's going to be a lot of biographical stuff I'll bring up. So I do want everyone to bring up that stuff if that's what you're interested in. But I just want us to try to think about that. Can we just read this about a guy and a girl, you know, in the mountains? Can it just be that? So thinking about that for next week.
Catherine, do you want me to say anything about your connection and mine between Big Two-Hearted River and On Writing, or do you want me just to shut up?
No, please do. Please do.
So something that connects us is that On Writing was cut as the ending. I think it's the last 9 or 10 pages of On Writing was originally the ending of the Big Two-Hearted River. And Gertrude Stein read the Big Two-Hearted River and told Ernest Hemingway he needed to get rid of all that crap. And he thought about it and reread it, and finally gave Gertrude Stein credit for getting rid of some laden material. So it'll be interesting to look at On Writing, right, divorced from its original material.
but that is why it ended up just a little vignette. You're absolutely right about that. And it really did not belong in that story. I mean, people would have been super confused to have it end like that. So, but yeah, but looking at On Writing, we know that that's Hemingway talking, but can we look at the other stories, An Alpine Idyll, Cross Country Snow? Can we look at those as just a guy named Nick? You know, so let's maybe try to do that. And but even Wedding Day is really very biographical, so it's gonna be hard for the vignettes, but I just think the two stories at least we'll try.
Nice. So I actually found out this week, I wrote a historical article about Hemingway and Hadley's wedding in Horton Bay, which was September 3rd of 1921. So this is the centennial. We're doing a big celebration, recreating the wedding reception here in Walloon Lake. And we'll be doing that as a fundraiser for the Michigan Hemingway Society with many of what we presume to be potential menu items that they would have had at the wedding. And Michigan History Magazine has just informed me they will be running that in the July-August issue. So I'm super excited, not only to have my first byline in Michigan History Magazine, but really to see what they do with all the photographs that we've provided and the layout. I always love to see the layout of the piece when it comes out. So that'll be super exciting. I also want to remind everybody that on Thursday, May 13th at 5 o'clock, we will be meeting at Melrose Township Park in downtown Walloon Lake, right next to the Hemingway Historical Marker. And that's where we will begin our caravan tour through the area, including Horton Bay and out to the Nick Adams Preserve. And then we will end back in downtown Walloon Lake and have a Hemingway inspired cocktail at the historic Walloon Lake Inn. So that is free for anybody that wants to join us in that activity. And then also we'll be hosting a birthday celebration on Wednesday, July 21st in the village. And then of course the wedding reception and a full Hemingway homecoming series of events over Labor Day weekend. But also just to reiterate what was said earlier, you know, there is something about walking in Hemingway's footsteps up here or wading in the waters where he went. And I was talking with Chris Struble about it just recently. You know, you look at all the other places where Hemingway has been, and outside of maybe Paris in the movable feast years, I don't think that there's any place that you can walk to as many sites that are tied to Hemingway as you can here in Northern Michigan. You have how many historical markers now? We've got one in Kalkaska. We've got one in the Pigeon River. One's coming in Walloon Lake. I said to Chris, why don't we put one in Frankfurt where he got off the steamer on that trip where he walked across to Kalkaska? Why don't we have one up at the Fox River? You know, we have places in Ann Arbor and in Grand Rapids where he was that aren't necessarily Nick Adams related, but we really have the potential to showcase so many great places here in Michigan that people can still stand in the exact spot, put their hand into the cool stream there and see the mint and places that you can sit where he was. And I don't think you get that in Cuba or in Key West or in these other places as intimately as you get that here. And I think that's the dedication of the folks that started and worked hard at the Michigan Hemingway Society to make that happen. So our goal here in Walloon Lake is to make this an active versus a passive Hemingway destination and get people to come up here and do some writing, maybe do some painting and do some fishing and explore these areas. And everyone that's been involved in this, Jen and Don and Catherine and our other presenters, Peter and Sean, and of course, Chris, have helped make that come to fruition. I had a meeting with the village last night, and they are just thrilled with the level of participation. So I want to thank everybody that's joined us thus far. One more virtual week, and then hopefully we'll see many of you on the 13th in downtown. So with that.
And you've posted all that information about where to meet and everything. That's been posted.
Yep, there's a Facebook event for it, Catherine.
Okay.
So hopefully you and Blaine will join us for that. And this video will be added hopefully tonight or maybe tomorrow to the YouTube. So we've had a lot of people that are watching that if they can't join in. But one more virtual week, and then we'll take a little caravan tour to see some of these sites firsthand. So thank you all again for joining, and look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.